Hello, thank you for joining us at Insight today for our second conversation. We're talking today with authors James Price and Kenneth Melchin. They've written a book, Spiritualizing Politics Without Politicizing Religion, the Example of Sargent Shriver. So welcome, Jamie and Ken. Jamie is the founding director of the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute. And Ken is coming to us from Canada. He is a professor emeritus in theology at St. Paul University and the director of the Lonergan Center there at St. Paul. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Good to be here, Paul.
So Jamie, can we start with you? And can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your interest in how you got interested in Sargent Shriver and the work that you've done with the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute?
How I got interested in Sargent Shriver. I got interested in Sarge when his son, Tim Shriver, who was a student of mine at Catholic University when I was teaching there at the time, introduced me to him in the late 80s, I guess it was. Oh, wow. So I knew him for the last 20 or so years of his life. And Tim asked me to help arrange or 75th birthday, I think it was 75th. Yeah, 75th birthday present for his dad, which was to set up a program, a graduate program for returned Peace Corp volunteers based on ethics and social change. And so I began to get interested in Sarge on that basis, and set up a program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County to do that, which was a great deal of fun. Met Sarge there. And then later, Tim had an opportunity to set up the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute, and he needed somebody to help the family figure out what that was and what it would do. And he gave me a call. And so for the last 18, 20 years, that's what I've been doing.
So they set the thing up and then you figured out what it was going to do. Right.
So I was able to bring Lonergan, and it was a wonderful open slate opportunity. And the focus, I mean, Tim knew, as did everybody, that Sarge was a deeply spiritual man and that his spirituality engaged him in all of the work that he did as a public servant and a citizen diplomat. And so Tim's question was, since peace is something that lots of organizations work on and have since before Christianity was founded, what was going to be distinctive about this particular one? And it was to take Sarge's example and figure out what his method was, how he integrated spirituality in it, and how that informed his creation of the Peace Corps, his work on the war on poverty, how he was an ambassador to France and nuclear arms control, all that stuff. And so I had a wonderful opportunity to just dig in.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. What a great birthday present.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And for me too.
And Ken, what's your what brought you to the Sargent Shriver Institute, or to writing the book and your involvement there?
Sure. Jamie and I have known each other from going back to the early 80s. I was a Lonergan. I have been a Lonergan scholar since the early 80s. And one of the things, and we met at a conference that was on Lonergan in the West Coast, US. And I followed his work ever since. I got involved in the 1980s in this new emerging field that was called conflict studies. It really was something that previously didn't exist as a field of study, and that it was only emerging. And at that point, I was listening to all kinds of people make claims about alternative ways of resolving conflicts in a non-violent way. And a lot of the literature I was studying was arms control literature. And I'm a scholar in the field of ethics and a faculty of theology. And I met people who were saying, oh, well, there's non-violent ways of resolving conflicts. And I said, I don't believe you, but I don't disbelieve you. I want to know, like, what is it? How do you do it? And there was a large number of people who were reading books and giving lectures. Then I met one person who was, and her name is Cheryl Picard, and she was a practitioner. She was a practicing mediator, and she spoke about mediation, and I said to myself, well, I don't believe it, but I don't disbelieve it. And so I asked her, how do you do it? And she said, do you want to know? And I said, yes. And she said, well, then come along and I'll show you. And I said, well, what does that mean? She said, I'll train you as a mediator in this program. And so that was in the early 80s. And so we got to know each other and we worked together. And I did discover that what she was doing was quite transformative. And it was quite different than what I observed a lot of other people doing. Scroll forward 15 years, and in around 2000, when Cheryl's own work was also in the midst of kind of an explosion of literature in the field of mediation, conflict mediation, and people were saying, oh, there's this model, and then there's this model, and there's this model. And she said to me one day, she said, I don't know what kind of model I am. I don't seem to fit in any one of them. And I said, oh, I know what you do. And she said, what? She said, you get insights. And so I said, she said, what's an insight? And I said, do you want to know? She said, yeah. And I said, do you want to find out? Then come on along. And so she actually came and accompanied our work at the Lonergan Center, and that we used insights from Lonergan to study what she was doing. And that we came up with what at the time started looking to us as rather original ways of thinking about what a conflict is and how conflict gets resolved, particularly when it's resolved peacefully. And then Jamie and I got to know each other as Lonergan scholars, as participants in one of the big events that happens annually at Boston College. And that's when he told me about his work on Sarge. And I was presenting kind of a progress report on some of the stuff that Cheryl and I were doing that led up to the book that Cheryl and I wrote together, Transforming Conflict Through Insight. And so Jamie, once he told me about Sarge, I said, wow, this is really interesting. There's some amazing connections, you know. And of course, being a Catholic theologian who had followed the history of Catholic theology during the 60s and 70s, I was particularly interested in this guy living and working during this time. So Jamie and I ended up kind of putting our heads together, and through that, I got to know Sarge, not personally as Jamie had known him, but through a study of his speeches. And I just found this totally compelling.
Great. Wonderful. Thanks. So the book that you've written together, The Spiritualizing Politics Without Politicizing Religion, the Example of Sargent Shriver. What can you tell us about the book itself? So it's a very compelling title and a provocative title in some ways. Can you tell us about it? Like, what's this book about?
I'll take a first crack at that. You can fill it in, Ken. The book really was an attempt to clarify how Sarge's way of going about making peace, how Sarge's way of integrating his own deep spirituality into the programs he created transformative situations that open people to the spirit without the antagonizing problem of politicizing religion. So we put the answer to the contemporary culture wars in the title. How do you spiritualize politics without politicizing religion? And we decided to show, or try to show people in the book, that this is how Sarge did it, as a hope that it might be useful in starting conversations and people thinking in different ways. Our view was, as you know from Lonergan, one of the problems with the longer cycle of decline is that as the cycle gets tighter and tighter, insights that were available in the past are no longer available because there's a surrender of intelligence and what we hoped to do with Sarge was, I mean, he had access to some insights in the relationship of religion and politics and spirituality and social change that are tougher to get these days in these polarized times. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to set forth his example in his terms, really, to show how it might be rethought as a recovery of what was really kind of possible in the early 1960s when he was doing this thinking before some Supreme Court decisions came in and began to start the conflict that winds everybody up today.
Okay, great. So you mentioned that the phrase longer cycle of decline. There may be some people who aren't familiar with that term, and you see the book as related to our current culture wars. So can you put those two things together for us? Like, how do these culture wars that shape our society today, how does that fit into this idea of a longer cycle of decline?
You want to take a shot at that, Ken?
Sure. If we were to step back a second, one of the things that Lonergan realized when he set out to do his work was that philosophy and theology needs to catch up to something that was initiated by modern science, but that had given rise to a cultural change, but that people were still using ideas from that weren't really appropriate for this cultural change. And it's what he called the shift from classicism to historical consciousness. And that what happens with this historical consciousness is that you're no longer able to think about one culture as the norm that sets the standard that every other culture has to measure up to, because you have a plurality of cultures. And so, in a sense, it looks on the face of it like a step forward, because, oh, now all of a sudden we know about a diversity of cultures. But when you're in this new framework, the first thing that happens is that you lose touch with all the resources for making judgments as to why something is good, because they come from a particular culture. And your preoccupation with diversity gives rise to a kind of a compulsion to look at every new thing or every diverse thing as equally wonderful or equally valid or equally awful. And you can't really make the difference. And so there's a sense in which this inability to measure up to this movement forward that has happened in civilization has resulted in an impoverishment, and it's resulted in a kind of a decline that isn't just a particular person, it's not just a particular group, but it's a decline that shapes the way everybody gets to think, because it shapes the tools that you think with. And so the longer cycle of decline, and there's many contributing factors to the longer cycle of decline, but one of them that Lonergan himself knew, and that we discerned really has a key role to play in the culture wars, is this kind of movement forward from classicism to historical consciousness, but that gets you trapped in a set of problems that actually drag you down rather than help you up. And so we had to think through what is it that Shriver was doing, that Sarge was doing, that actually allowed him to move in this new space without getting dragged down. And that was the incredible thing, because he didn't.
He moved in the space of a plurality of cultures, so this a space where there are multiple ways of achieving full humanity without getting stuck into a relativism, or without, taking a club to other people's cultures.
Without becoming doctrinaire, and that's right.
Becoming doctrinaire.
Yeah, he was able to differentiate, and he was able to differentiate the inner movement of the spirit from the doctrines that talked about it, or that the practices that carried it or opened it up. So by differentiating that, he was able to think much more nimbly across cultures and pay attention to the data of that inner spiritual consciousness and to see where they would work and how they would flourish and how they wouldn't, in a way that wasn't generally available to other people. And it didn't matter if it was particularly conscious in other people, in Peace Corps volunteers, for instance. It just mattered that he knew it. And the other thing was, he was not a methodologist himself, so he built these programs that integrated it, but he didn't, and he talked about what he was doing, but he didn't talk methodologically about it. So one of our tasks was to sort out what was the method operative in his work. And that's what was both difficult and fun about the project. And so
Right.
what we're talking about, the longer cycle is contrast to the shorter cycle, right? The shorter cycle would be the fight between those two cultures, so the fight between two parties who are vying for power. And he Lonergan and he Shriver was looking for a framework, and not looking for, but operating from a framework that would transcend those battles.
Okay. And you mentioned, sort of the inner spiritual process, struggle, and use the word doctrinaire. And one of the things you seem to be doing in the book is you're trying to appeal to, or make a case to both conservatives and progressives within society generally, and within Catholicism, or within Christianity, or within religions. That's that very tension between, how some people phrase it as, the inner world of passion and objectivity. How do you see the book navigating or speaking to those two camps? What do you have to say to conservatives that they can agree with, and what do you have to say to progressives that they can agree with? How do you get them both on your side?
That's a very good, pardon?
Do you want to go ahead with that?
Sure, and then you can fix it. What we tried to do was get inside the mind and heart of Sarge, and just to show how he would have done it, and then to explain that. And one of the places we focused on a number of places, but one of the places we focused for the genesis of the polarization that is driving all politics now, were the set of Supreme Court decisions in the United States that talked about the relationship of church and state. The religion clauses in the First Amendment to the Constitution that said there should be no establishment of religion or fooling with free exercise thereof. So when the courts got around to, when people got around to applying the 14th Amendment to the First Amendment, meaning extending it across the states, there were some battles that came up, and some answers that the Supreme Court gave. It was Justice Black who first said, well, let me step back and just say the genius of the framers of the Constitution in writing those clauses was that they were able to distinguish religion and politics. The problem that was going on was that the political sphere was being used as the enforcement arm of the church. When you establish the Congregational Church in Massachusetts or the Anglican Church in Virginia, you're saying that everybody has to be this, or they are a second-class citizen. They can't serve in government. They can't serve in the military. And if a Quaker sneaks in from Pennsylvania, they can 3 times they can be executed. I mean, there are all kinds of laws that were conflict raising. And so Jefferson and Madison and the others were saying, no, there has to be freedom of conscience here. What don't you understand about the fact that it's between the individual and their God that determines the relationship, not a confession, not anything like that. And so 100 and more years went by, and that governed the way people set that up in the United States. Canada was a little different, other places, England's different, but this was the framework for the United States. But then there came to be overlaps that were hard to sort out. Could you use taxpayers' money to send Catholic kids to Catholic high schools? Could you say prayers at the beginning of the day? Could you have scripture readings at the assembly? Could you pray with your football team, all these kinds of things. And so they were talking then no longer about the distinction between religion and politics. They were talking about the relationship between the two. And that was where that's where things got tricky, because what was available methodologically for them, or the tools they had to think with, were institutional connection. So one of the things that Hugo Black said was, the way we want to relate the two is by building a wall of separation between them. There could be no, there should be, so the wall of separation became absolute. So people began thinking about politics as a secular sphere and religion as a private sphere. And of course, there were many people who said, "Are you out of your mind? I don't experience it that way. And you can't kick God out of school, and you can't." And then others were thinking that Catholics or evangelicals or Jews were running roughshod over their freedom, religious freedom, and people began fighting about that. And for a long time, the more secular side won the court battles, but it mobilized the religious right and the conservative Catholic wings of the church, and they began to fight those things. And so I think, Ken, you want to finish up with that?
All right, I can take the next chapter. The thing that was compelling for me when I first joined Jamie in the project is that he had already done a lot of the analyses that he just narrated to you, and I was playing catch up. I was reading Sargent's speeches, and I was trying to understand the context. And what I realized is that what we were able to observe in Sarge in his speeches is a man or person with very, very traditional Catholic formation whose practice continued all the way through his life. I mean, this man was a very, very traditional practicing Roman Catholic through all of his adult life. And that he's drawing upon resources that are very traditional Catholic, or at least mainstream. He's using these resources, he's drawing on these resources to do things that are very, very progressive. And so he's doing progressive things, and he's using language to justify the progressive thing that comes entirely from these conservative resources. And I'm saying to myself, whoa, this is really interesting. This isn't the typical social justice rhetoric as a basis for kind of progressive practice. This isn't what we would typically associate with a conservative practice that's being described and animated and put forward in conservative language. It's traditional conservative language being used to justify progressive practices. And I said, this is very, very strange. How is this happening? How is he doing this? And as we came to understand it, what we came to realize is that he's actually, and what Jamie said earlier, that Sarge himself wasn't the methodologist, and we saw that our call is to kind of step into the fray and to say methodologically, what is he doing when he's doing something that is recognizable by both sides, if you like, of the battle. What is he doing, and how is he doing it? And that the thing that is amazing is that what he's doing is he's using his own mind, and when by mind, I mean both his mind and his spirituality as operative in his consciousness. He's using his mind in a way that if we were to adequately explain it, would be identifiable and recognizable by people on both sides. And so that's what we sought to do, which of course is what the basis of Lonergan's work. But our work had to be not just kind of spouting off and formulating words from Lonergan's texts, but we had to kind of use that ourselves to understand how that's operative and what Sarge was doing. And so